Hello and welcome to a cursed edition of Susie's Book Bag, hosted by me, Susie Fay. If you're watching this, the only way to lift the curse will be immediately to hit like and subscribe. I really hope, for your sake, that you manage to do that right now. I have got a Yale book bag. We are talking about a Yale book, as you might have guessed. I'm going to be talking to Owen Davies, who is a specialist in the writing of books on magic. So we have this book, Grimoires, that came out in 2009. And this is the very latest, it's a very handsome book published by Yale, The Art of the Grimoire. I'm now going to invite in Owen into the book bag. Welcome, Owen.
Thank you very much, Susie. Good to be here.
Sorry for the slightly silly intro there. I think you're probably used to a few jokes about your specialisation in writing on magic books. You are coming at me from the University of Hertfordshire, where you are Professor of Social History. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, broad title.
What does that have to do with magic? And also, social history sounds incredibly vast. It sounds everything from clogs and teapots to, well, books. So, talk us a little bit about your day job.
Yeah, I mean, social history, in broad brush terms, is exploring kind of everyday lives in the past. And I study across, as you know from reading the book, I study across centuries. I'm not like an 18th century historian or a 19th century historian or a 20th century. So I like to follow themes through as long as possible as I can, and I like to take a broad approach to sort of doing micro studies to macro studies to global history. So social history is just kind of the approach is that I'm interested in the people as distinct, particularly, and obviously you can't get away from politics and war and everything else because that affects all the people, but the main approach is exploring what were people doing, thinking, believing in the past.
And the history of magic goes back right to the very start of human history, doesn't it? I think there are things scratched on bits of stone that are very ancient indeed, that are spells, protective charms, even
the earliest
conjuring at devils.
Well, the earliest forms of writing are on clay tablets. We're talking about over 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, and as soon as writing is developed, and this is called cuneiform, which is a kind of a series of marks which are stamped into wet clay and then dried, and remarkably survive in their thousands. It's extraordinary survival. And when these are deciphered today, and you look at what are people writing when they can write, when they first can start writing, a lot of it's administration, bushels of wheat and transfers and things. Some of it's just mundane sort of communications. Quite a lot of it is obviously to do with royal courts and with priesthoods and stuff. But right in there amongst all the administration, right from the beginning, we find the recording of spells and magic and rituals, mostly to do with demons. The world is full of demons, and ill health is very much interpreted as being caused by a series of demonic male and female characters who are all around. So, when we look at these cuneiform clay tablets, we know that magic is a fundamental aspect of people's everyday lives. Because it helps them deal with the misfortunes that are happening all the time, just as they do in modern life today.
So the history of magic also involves the history of science and the history of medicine.
It's all wrapped up. I mean, I'm an atheist myself, but I'm not one of those sorts of Richard Dawkins-esque sort of things where science conquers all and we should be living in an age of science. You go back to early recorded history, and magic, religion, and science have always been entwined one way or another. And so, if today we live in a world where people practice magic, where religion is obviously fundamental to lives across the world, and an age of amazing science, and we find that going right back to the ancient world and the scientific developments. We have a priesthood, we have religious rituals, and we have magic going on within there, interwoven between these types. And alchemy is a good example of a scientific, magical sort of relationship, and religion and magic. Well, the use of various forms of religious rituals in non-official forms is a form of magic. So the people who try and unpick, and this all comes back to the early anthropologists of the late 19th century, who were trying to make sense of human development and cultural development. And the anthropologists, famously James Fraser, Golden Bough, good example, but he was just one of a number, so I wouldn't want to just pick him out. And they basically trying to make sense of this development, and they're the ones who come up with this idea that there was an age of magic to begin with. Then there was an age of religion, and that's obviously tied to particularly to the rise of the Christian faith. It's the kind of Christo-historical sort of development, and then the age of science that they are living in at that time. And so they're the ones who propound this, which is a powerful thing, from magic to religion to science, and we're now in this age of science, and that kind of does shape a lot of thinking today still. When people think about magic, people in the past used to do that sort of thing way back. That's all part of this idea of progression, which really is deeply problematic as a concept, as we know today. If you want to try and rationalize human behavior in the contemporary world, you'll find it hard to try and fit it into an age of science.
Well, you do go straight from these cuneiform tablets and things like the bones in China, the oracle bones.
Oracle bones, yeah.
And you sort of trace it right the way through to things like anime and the occult online. But I want to sort of take you back to the definition of grimoire itself, which is a book, isn't it? And it's sort of most simple terms, it's a book of magic.
Yeah, in simple terms, it's a book of magic which contains conjurations of some sort. There's other forms of magic. There's books of natural magic, which is about the secret properties of stones and plants and things, which don't have conjurations in them. So it's a broad definition, it's a working definition, and it's easy to kind of pick away at it, and I could do that myself. But it's a useful catch-all term for these books of magic, which sometimes aren't all about conjurations, but they contain some form of conjuration, whether it's the spirits, the angels, the devil, or whatever, depending on which culture it's in, because these are conjurations are a global phenomenon, and as are books of magic. So yeah, but grimoire, that's my definition of a grimoire. And obviously the new book's called that, but actually quite a lot of the material in there is actually about relation between writing and image. So it's for the books, for the purpose of the book and a title, it makes sense in a broad terms, even though not all of it is about grimoires. But yeah, it's a book, and so we can talk about grimoires in the ancient world, particularly papyrus, because when we get papyrus writing, we have scrolls up to kind of 15 meters long. So in other words, it's book length, and it can contain narratives, it contains stories, and it can be a compilation of spells and conjurations and other forms of talismanic images and things like that. So when I talk about grimoire, it's not necessarily a book that you open like in a one book. It could be in this scroll form, or in you go to the Far East and you go to Sumatra and places in the Far East, and you've got concertina books, which again they kind of fold out that way. So by book, we shouldn't just think of kind of the classic Western page after page.
Were they secret things? I mean, were they kind of closely guarded secrets and owned only by very particular individuals?
Certainly in the past. I mean, the story of grimoires is one of slow but sure democratization of they're becoming more and more available to people. But if we're talking right up to the kind of before print, age of print in particular, we are talking about a very small percentage of the population who have access to these. One, you have to be literate, highly literate, because quite a lot of these works are obviously written, most of them are written in Latin, as well as occasionally with elements of vernacular in it, but also you get smatterings of ancient Greek and Hebraic texts and things, depending, again, on different cultures. But most of it's in Latin, particularly the medieval ones, obviously. So yeah, it's only a small percentage, and we're looking really, in the ancient world into the early medieval period, we're largely talking about priesthoods who have the literary ability to write this, as well as the knowledge but also then, the aristocracy of whatever culture it is as well. So, and that's obviously only a very tiny portion of the population. So yeah, it's secret knowledge, and it's held by a very few people, and they're the ones who are inscribing these manuals about how to do things, and the instructions and the texts for conjuring, so that they can be passed on, particularly within terms of a Christian monastic context, so they can be put in and passed on to the next generation in the library of the monasteries, for example.
So in that case, would they be kind of warning texts, like don't do any of this? I mean, I can't imagine monks wanting to conjure up demons.
There's a few examples that some do, because the ways in which people entered the monasteries and became monks was not always necessarily by choice per se. Often, the second son would end up being the person who went off to become a monk and then do good works for the family, get through purgatory, etc. So yeah, it's and even pre-Christian in the ancient world, we get priests who are clearly going beyond what they should normally be doing as part of their, I call their religious professional life as well. So yeah, there's always rogues out there, always rogues. But in general, you're right. Most of the clergy who are using books of magic or grimoires are doing it to try and particularly communicate with the angels. They're trying to get knowledge of God's world. So the whole debate, particularly in the early medieval period, is about the clergy who are writing these books and performing these adjurations from them. Is about, I'm trying to communicate with the angels. I'm trying to understand God's world and God's work to attain a higher spiritual understanding and a higher knowledge of my own spirituality, as well as enlightened understanding of, as I say, scripture. But the thing is, the way the debate goes is that there's other theologians and clergy say you may think you're conjuring up angels, but in fact, all you're doing is letting the door open for the devil and demons. And so that becomes the fundamental debate in theology between magic as a positive, performative, religious, spiritual exercise, and the interpretation that the devil is so wily that you may think that he's going to intrude, and that way lies heresy, essentially. So yeah, so that's the debate that really kicks off in particularly 13th century across Europe. So it's always it's a dangerous thing to be doing, put it that way. And whether it's in the ancient world or in the early medieval period, clearly these books, these grimoires, were kept away and hidden, from other prying eyes.
And does that help their survival? Because you imagine the Inquisition going around burning as many of them as they could get their mitts on.
Yeah, that is part of it. I mean, in ancient Rome, there were book burning sessions of magic books. This isn't just a medieval thing with inquisitions. It's happening in the ancient world. The Romans are trying to destroy caches of books, whether it's which are considered to be. I mean, the Romans are very open about religion, but they get scared of, authorities get scared of magic because it can be potentially used in political ways, and that's where the concerns lie on this. And so book burning goes right back, and obviously the early Christian church was very happy burning books which were considered to be heretical or pagan or non-Christian, and that these should be destroyed as well. So there's a long history of burning magic books, and it's remarkable in one sense how many survive of these texts. And I say part of that must be because they were very well hidden and secretly passed down. But who knows what we've lost? We have lots of references to magic books which no longer exist, and so we're only working with part of the physical surviving tradition.
And do you track these down wherever possible when you're researching these books? I mean, what's the furthest you've gone to find an actual grimoire?
I mean, most of them are, if we're looking at the ones in the ancient world and papyrus, essentially we're looking at papyrus scrolls, of magic, very few of which survive as full scrolls. Often what we have is fragments, but we have enough fragments to be able to piece together what a totality of it might have looked like. On this, some of the best preserved stuff, which increasingly now, since I wrote grimoires, which was in like 2009, digitization has come on a long way. And so these days, for example, some great projects which have been digitizing Coptic magic books, which are a fascinating aspect of the history of grimoires. And the Coptic texts, some of those are scrolls and papyrus, but also in the Coptic magic tradition, obviously, early Christian church in Ethiopia. And so at the same time as we start getting this Christianized form of magic appearing, particularly in these Coptic texts, they are also adopting parchment. So it's a fascinating period. We're talking about 500 to 800 AD, that sort of period. But so Coptic magic to me is a kind of fascinating key transition phase from the ancient world to the medieval world, both in terms of technology of books and writing, but also the ways in which magic from pre-Christian times gets transformed, absorbed, Christianized.
And do magic books start getting printed right at the beginning of printing itself?
Near enough. I mean, the earliest sort of magic books that get printed are actually natural magic. And these are
stones and properties.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. Yeah. Animals, properties of a lizard skin, properties of precious, semi-precious stones, obviously herbs, and wide range of herbal. And most of these early, within several decades of Gutenberg press, most of these early natural magic texts are obviously based on things from the ancient world, particularly Pliny the Elder's works on natural history. So there's these early print ones are drawing back on this ancient tradition, which is all part of the Renaissance and humanism and the rediscovery of the classical philosophy and medicine at this time. And so, those are the earliest ones. It's natural magic because it's seen as more legitimate. These aren't books of conjurations. The first sort of book conjurations come in a bit later in the second half of the 16th century. So it's several decades on, and printers expanded a lot. And it's originally from sort of Germanic presses. And one of the first early ones, we get the printing of the 3 books of occult philosophy of Agrippa and at this time. And Agrippa was a Renaissance occult philosopher who actually rejected conjuration. And so one of the first books is 3 books of occult, which is about geomancy in particular. So it's not about kind of casting spells and things. In fact, he abhorred that sort of side of magic as being, say, blasphemous or at least or heretical. But after his death, and the book is published, 3 books of occult philosophy are published after his death anyway. But then an enterprising German publisher produces the 4th book, and this is kind of a key moment in print and magic. And so a printer goes, okay, let's use the Agrippa name, which has become well known enough, notorious enough, and let's create a 4th book which does have more overtly magical conjuration text and is bundled with another book called Heptameron and Arbatel. So it's in this late 16th century, coming out of Germany, that we start getting print books of magic, which then get kind of translated. It's only nearly a century later until they're translated into English in the mid 17th century. But there's clearly, the point is, there's clearly a market for it. But there's lots of, it's right on the boundaries of what's legitimate or lawful at this time. In Catholic countries, the Vatican Index of Prohibited Books contains named magic books at this time. So the Vatican has clearly got the radar out about print and concerned about the circulation of magic books at this time. Less so, obviously, in Protestant faiths, because it's not one faith; it's different authorities with different Protestant religions, and so that it's partly why Germany, which obviously is at the heartland of the Reformation, becomes one of the first centres of printing magic. Out of the prying eyes.
Part of the story that you tell is about the idea that everybody's saying that their book is based on ancient wisdom. I mean, there's quite a lot of people writing under different names or adopting names that will give their books more cachet, if you like. And certainly when we move on, as magic books become, as you say, more and more democratized and, you know, into sort of the pulp era, people love saying everything comes from ancient Egypt or everything comes from biblical times, don't they? That's an important part of the story. How do you deal with the kind of fakery element? Because clearly some people are genuine and some people are just ripping.
That's fundamental to the history of magic books and grimoires. You know, it is false attribution is, you know, one of the defining things of a grimoire in a sense, because you know, and you get it right through, certainly from ancient Egypt onwards, not back to days of cuneiform. That's much more simple form, but certainly from ancient Egypt onwards, we get that, you know, and Solomon is one of the early key figures here, where books are attributed to King Solomon and to Moses. Those are the two figures. So in other words, it's actually drawing upon obviously Judaic, you know, Old Testament figures for these pseudo authorships. And then we get ones which are completely invented. So in the medieval period, we had the Sworn Book of Honorius, and Honorius is meant to be this 4th century, 3rd century, you know, great mage in Alexandria. It doesn't exist. So we got the biblical figures who are the false authorship. Then we get the kind of invented legendary sorcerers and magicians, and then as we move into the later medieval period, and into the early modern period, we then get real medieval theologians, clergy like Roger Bacon becoming grimoire authors. Then we get the likes of Agrippa and Renaissance magicians having false attribution. So every time there's a new genre of magic book comes out, there are always whoever devises it is always trying to find an attribution which they think will basically make it more popular. Who are the most popular names? And that's why in the 17th and 18th centuries, Faust becomes one of the big authors. You know, in Germany, in the German sort of manuscript to print, Faust becomes the key figure in the 18th century, late 17th and 18th century. You know, so many books being manuscripts being attributed to the legendary Faust as well. So yeah, there's always false. And when you come into the more modern sort of, you talk about the pulp novel, you know, pulp novels, the cheap print, cheapo ones. We go back to kind of Moses again, and we go back to Solomon, the Key of Solomon. But also we have new figures coming like the Cyprianus, Saint Cyprian, or Cyprian the magician monk who supposedly conjured up the devil in the 11th century on top of a mountain and was given this strange book of knowledge. So new ones can always crop up to add to the pantheon. But yeah, nearly every grimoire, or well-known one, has a false attribution to it.
I think you say something like, if there's a false attribution, that kind of underlines that it's a true grimoire.
Yeah,
exactly. It underlines its authenticity.
Yeah, exactly. That makes it more. Yeah, that's what makes it an authentic grimoire, is its lack of authentic authorship. Exactly.
We should talk about the artistic aspects of it. I mean, this it is called The Art of the Grimoire, and it's a very, very beautiful book indeed, filled with fascinating illustrations. You can see on the cover, I think that's an alchemical image, isn't it? So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the art. That's a very important part of the story, isn't it? And a lot of that influences the present day. You know, magic circles, sigils. It's a very rich tradition.
Yeah, and when I was writing grimoires, that was trying to trace the history of the books. It wasn't so much about content. Obviously, I provide content to it, but it was tracing. It's kind of just as much book history as history of magic. It's the two things entwined. And so when when I was thinking about this book, I thought, what do I want to do different? I don't want to just do an illustrated version of Grimoires, if you know what I mean, you know, the old book. So kind of was two elements I really wanted to come to the fore for this book. One of that is to focus on the imagery. So much of grimoire scholarship is about the text, you know, and trying to find derivations and nature of conjurations and things. And I wanted to think about how over the centuries and millennia, imagery became, you know, increasingly important and a fundamental part of both the aesthetic of magic and the practice of magic over that time. And the other part of what I'm trying to get across in the new book is about the global nature of that relationship between the artistic representation of magic, or images that facilitate magic, and how you find it over and over again in cultures which have a history of writing. Because you know, once the materials are there in terms of inks and papers, that you can actually do quite fine and detailed illustration, and particularly print as well has drawbacks to it in terms of artistic possibilities. But whenever there's new technology, you also find people are using those new technologies to provide even more intricate or better or different forms of illustration, whether it be, as I say, you know, for the actual practice of magic, or just to illustrate what devils and demons look like that you want to conjure up or are threatening you, which is the other part of this. Well, you know, go right back to some of the early ancient texts, particularly Aramaic incantation bowls from sort of late antiquity. The images there are these are the demons that are attacking you, you know. So it's visually representing it for, you know, for, in a sense, for the client on this. I say another ones are images and words and symbols of power, which enact the magic. So art is used for different purposes, and I've, you know, had great fun picking away at that from different cultures across the globe.
There's some very cute looking demons in the book.
Yeah.
There's some nice Japanese ones as well. I mean, you look at their amazing tradition of depicting demons who do various things. I mean, this is a world where precision is very important, isn't it? I mean, if you make a mistake when you're conjuring up a demon, things could go very wrong for you. So it seems to me that feeds into the look of grimoires themselves. You know, the lettering is careful. The imagery is very careful.
Yeah, part of it is that, because if you're a conscientious ritual magician, you have to follow to the letter what's represented. So if there's an instructions for you know, sealing the spirit of the dead or something, and you have to, and it's instructing you to draw a circle on the ground, you know, with various words of power and secret words like tetragrammaton or aglar or whatever, and various symbols, you've kind of got to do it to the letter. But at the same time, you know, there's lots of people with these books and using these books who aren't really that bothered by this sort of stuff. And it, you know, I wouldn't want to give the impression that everyone is slavishly following these things, because everybody becomes adaptable, and people do adapt, and people, you know, part of the history of magic is about the history of experimentation. So, you know, some magic books are actually quite freewheeling in terms of the way the people are using it. And a good example of that would be cunning folk who are popular magicians, who basically take imagery and words, some of which they have no idea what it means, but it looks magical. It looks magical, and it sounds magical, and they will cut and paste, in a sense, you know, those into a written charm, which they then sell for a few pounds to their client to protect them from witchcraft or from thieves or whatever. So that's what I call bricolage magic, written magic, where it's like, oh, that image looks magical, I'll stick it in the charm. I'll add a few squiggly, you know, things that look a bit like ancient Greek or Hebrew. I don't know what it is, a little bit, you know, the client's not going to know. You know, can't read it. So, you know, these books of magic and these texts are used in multiple different ways, from a very, very, you know, almost academic use to something which is much more pragmatic and like, you know, scrapbooky.
Well, one of the things that the study shows is that human obsessions don't really change very much over time. So cursing people is one thing, attracting love is another thing. I was quite intrigued to see that finding treasure is quite, I suppose that speaks even today to our desire to win the lottery.
Yeah, it's, as you say, fundamental human desire. If you're dirt poor, what's the best thing can happen in your life? You discover a treasure, or you go out and search for one using conjuration or magic books. And it ties in. I've always been fascinated with tomb robbers, whether it's people digging into Bronze Age burial mounds in Denmark or it's in pyramids, because they were doing that in antiquity. So there were clearly people out there who were going, "Yeah, I'm not so bothered about the gods," or probably had gone and bought or purchased magic texts to protect them as they entered the tomb to steal the gold. But their main purpose, is probably using magic to be able to just get the gold, get the treasure, and that follows right through the history, and I talked about the Cyprianus book in the 19th century. This became this very popular Cyprianus text, particularly in Spain. A whole genre develops in 19th century Spain, Portugal, where they actually kind of list buried treasures you could find in Galicia, and then provides you with the means of the spells in which to conjure this up, or at least deal with the ghosts or spirits or demons who are guarding this treasure. So, yeah, right from the early days of written magic, one of the key purposes is treasure hunting, and as you say, that's with us today. You can understand it. There was quite in the 19th century as well. In Egypt, there was a whole series of texts that circulated in print. Very few of them survive, which again are basically books of spells for tomb robbers and how to go and find the treasure in the desert, whatever, and then how to deal with the spirits. So you find it in these different cultures at different times, different bit, and it's one of those connectors again. It's like people doing exactly the same thing for the same motives, for the same reasons across millennia. And magic books are the proof of that. They give us this entry into people's desires and needs. And so while magic is often about misfortune, here it's about entrepreneurship and opportunity,
Yeah, exactly. Let's leap forward a little bit, because there were some aspects in the book that I was intrigued to learn about. I kind of knew about the classic magical texts, but when we get into the more modern era, you have things called powwows. Explain a little bit, and also books of Moses, which we have touched on a little bit. But what's the idea of the powwow publication?
Powwow is derives from a German tradition, not a German word. It's obviously it's a Native American word, powwow, a meeting. But the book, which is called Powwows, which was originally called the long hidden, long forgotten friend, was actually a German book of charms and spells and advice, which was brought over by German immigrants in the early 19th century to America, a guy called George Hoffman, and he basically is the first person to print a magic book in America in the 1840s, and it's originally printed in German in Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania. It's by a German printer. There was lots of German printing going on in mid-19th century America for obviously Germany. Germans at that time was a massive migration on top of the migrations that had taken place in the 18th century. So there's a ready market for German language magic books and texts, cheap, that could be used for, again, usually for protection. It's got things in it for making your gun shoot straight, dealing with witches, but also lots of more mundane sort of little healing charms for all the sorts of things like bleeding and malaria and all, whole range there. But come around 1900, and we get a boom in street literature. Obviously, urbanization is massive at this time in America, and we move from what you call a kind of a rural provincial sort of base of magic books and the audience for magic books to an urban one, and popularization. And so someone takes the long lost friend, decides to call it powwows. So it's kind of a marketing trick, basically, to try and get why buy my version of it rather than someone else's for $1. And so yeah, that's why it gets called powwows. So it's got nothing to do with Native American magic at all, and it's not quite clear why someone called it. Just probably a good word that people knew and a bit about, but didn't understand it. So it sounds a bit like, again, it sounds a bit magical, but that mixes and becomes quite a popular title, and sells to a multi-ethnic. So it moves from the German population to a much more multi-ethnic population, and moves into African American traditions as well. So it gets diffused culturally as well as geographically. So that's powwows, and it's an interesting example of how magic spreads amongst, again, in a period of massive migration, how magic becomes part of the things that comes with these populations. It doesn't get left behind in Germany.
No, but you need it all the more when you're in a new environment.
New environment, you can imagine, that there was demand there in a new environment when you're just literally carving a living out of the woodlands, setting up villages, and new settlements. I kind of say this quite a lot to people when I do talks, is that if you like watching your Western films, which are based in particularly in the late 19th century. Undoubtedly there was people practicing magic in the Wild West, but you won't see it in the Westerns. We tend to try and erase it from our conceptions of the past, but magic books show us that there was desire and popularity, and they were being used. It wasn't just some form of esoteric interest. They were being used, and they were being used by lots of people.
You get into the era of some quite colourful characters, or maybe the entire history of magic is filled with colourful characters. Do you have a favourite?
Yeah, for sure. Which is in the book, which is William Loudon de Lawrence. Is a clear favourite of mine, because he is a fascinating character, but it shows how he exploits magical belief to enhance his own. It's a cynical character. It's basically he comes from a dirt poor background in Ohio. So, he starts life as sweeping the railway crossing in his local settlement. But he's clearly got the smarts and has had enough education. And he starts selling hypnotism manuals door to door, as you do, and it ends up heading to Chicago. But he kind of realizes that there's a really booming market for these magic books if they're sold or look attractive enough. He's not necessarily in the market on the cheap side. There's lots of cheap ones. He's actually a bit more pricey than some of the other ones on the street, which just sell for $1. He's selling stuff for several dollars, which often have kind of gilt hardcover book covers. But anyway, what de Lawrence picks up on is a couple of things. One is, as an entrepreneur, he picks up on the boom in mail order at this period. So in other words, he realizes that you can sell magic books to an international market, and that's a key development here, by advertising in newspapers, and with mail order being much more advanced than it was in the mid 19th century. He's advertising in Nigerian newspapers, he's advertising in Caribbean newspapers, and he's advertising his magic books and all his other magical paraphernalia, and getting very successful at it. So that's one thing. He's using, again, it's the ways in which magic adapts to modernity and all this. And the other one is he taps into the idea of Eastern mysticism, which is quite strong at this period. So he shows images of himself dressed with a swami with a turban, and claims he has great knowledge of Hindu magic, even though his book of Hindu magic is actually a complete copy of a book of magic that came out in England in 1801. But he adds some images. Yeah, exactly, of the Magus. What he does, he takes the Magus and completely just reprints it, but then adds photos from India, of scenes from India, and he gives it this new veneer of Hinduness. Because he again, what's happening around him is that there's a growing market, particularly amongst African Americans and in the Caribbean as well, for anything that was considered to be secret knowledge from the Far East. and that ties in with kind of grassroots magical traditions. And obviously in the Caribbean you had Indian indentured labor coming there, just as you did in the Pacific. So people are coming in encounters with people from India, and that kind of can be exploited. So it's such a melting pot, and De Laurence is just very good at exploiting all the potentials and possibilities of internationalization and globalization. You know, I liken it to he's there before Coca-Cola. You know, Coca-Colanization is there. You know, spreading magic and magic books across either side of the Atlantic before Coca-Cola is kind of dominating and creating a global product. He gets prosecuted, you know, by the post office, American Post Office, for falsely trading by the post, as you can imagine. And he, you know, by the time he dies, this company's set up. He's got huge headquarters in Chicago, and he's making good money. He's a fascinating character, as I say. He's not a nice character. He plagiarizes terribly, you know. Just takes books of magic from the Golden Dawn authors and just says they're his, you know. And publishes them, because there's, you know, like the people you know, members of the Golden Dawn who are producing these translations of 17th century texts can't get him because he's not advertising or publishing in this country. He's got this other global market.
I think there was something about, I know Dickens got very exercised about this. There was something about publishing in the US that there wasn't a copyright.
That's it. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So they could just take somebody's work and print it there, and you know, the originator would not get a penny for it. So Dickens was very exercised about
that's that. Right. I remember that. You're right, and that's exactly, you know, De Laurence has got the smarts. He knows these things and knows how to exploit it, and very effectively.
Magic works for him.
Yeah. Oh, it certainly does. Yeah, magic makes money.
So once we're in talk about the Golden Dawn, we're not too far from Aleister Crowley and all those fun people. Is Crowley part of this story? I mean, he popularized magic, didn't he? But he didn't write grimoires as such.
No, I mean, again, he and his Arthur Waite and MacGregor Mathers, who are kind of big figures in the Golden Dawn, what they're all doing is trying to tap into secret older knowledge. So basically, they go into the Bibliothèque Arsenal in Paris, looking at some grimoires that were basically confiscated by the police in the 17th century, translating them as a kind of source books, you know. And the Golden Dawn, without going too much into it, are obviously drawing upon recent finds and translations of ancient Egyptian rituals and religion, and they're mashing it up with early modern mystical and magical texts and stuff like that. And you know, Crowley's in there doing similar things in the early 20th century, but he doesn't really contribute anything to the great history of magic texts, because he's part of a similar tradition of picking and mixing. So in other words, you know, he's doing that. He's taking that's the bit I want from that bit. That's the bit that I think that I want from there. So he's part of that tradition. But I think his role in the history of magic books is more to do with his notoriety. In terms of people being aware, the general public being aware that there are people out there practicing magic and they have magic books and texts and do rituals from it, because he becomes an international figure, usually lambasted and critiqued by the American press, the European press, and the British press. So he knows it is lovely, and as a narcissist, he's a self-promoter. And so he knows what he's doing, whipping up notoriety and the Great Beast and all those sorts of things. So for me, his role in this whole history is more as this figure who becomes a kind of a public figurehead of a modern magic tradition, which is drawing upon ancient magic.
But perhaps a little bit of a kind of side issue, what he's doing in terms of what we're talking about. What about a character that I find much more fascinating, which is Austin Osman Spare? Where does he fit into the story?
Yeah, well, but then there's that whole. I mean, this has been much written about. So which is about the, again, come back to that kind of the artistic interest in ritual magic. So you've got W.B. Yeats, who's part of the Golden Dawn. You've got Mina Mathers and others who come from a kind of arts background, and paintings. And Spare's part of that, who sees magic as a means of unlocking the imagination. I mean, that's one of the other purposes here. And sometimes that imagination gets transferred into actual paintings, whether Klimt or whatever. Lots of work being done on trying to create associations between early 20th century art and abstract art in particular, and magical tradition. So it's that whole. There is certainly. Focused around the Golden Dawn and also a bit around Crowley. There's that kind of sense that from an artistic point of view, that why not try and use these ancient techniques, so to speak, as a means of furthering my own kind of creative spiritual development.
So where are we today? I think it's very entertaining that the last parts of Art of the Grimoire, you look at the influence on film and television, which is still very, very strong. I mean, designers and creatives of shows are very much looking at the history of magic for ideas, aren't they?
Yeah, and then in the final chapter, I'm kind of getting across the idea of the fascination with the book, the magic book. And so quite a lot of the images in there are of the artists, designers, films, etc., creating books that look like magic books, but actually have no content in them, really. So there's kind of, isn't it? There's a visual fascination for what a grimoire should look like, and quite a few artists, at least. Some are trying to kind of recreate content in an artistic way. So in other words, they're books and texts which are not actually meant to be used for magic, but are meant to be looking like magic and mystical, which again is part of a long tradition. As I was saying before, quite a lot of the content here is full of pseudo language and symbols that really probably don't mean nothing. And so there's artists today who are kind of part of this long tradition of creating something that looks like magic, and I find that fascinating because it's telling us something about how magic expresses itself in different ways. And so today people could be fascinated with magic books without actually using them in magic, and obviously their representation, whether it's in manga and fantasy films or Harry Potter or whatever, they're fundamental. I mean, magic books are fundamental to the current genre of fantasy genres of whether it's set in the contemporary world or in some other fantasy world. You'll find magic books everywhere. So there's a kind of feeling that if you're going to represent magic, how do you do it? Have a book. And of course, that whole idea of book and transmission of knowledge is fundamental here as well. So the idea of a secret transmission that you rediscover is all part of those old narratives where, whether it's the 19th or 18th century, where say, I found this secret text in the bazaar in Cairo, or from a bookseller in Venice, or discovered under a rock, or whatever. And quite a lot of the current fantasy has the idea of just like about rediscovery of secret ancient knowledge, whether it's from a library or whatever. So similar tropes are there and present, but no longer necessarily part of a practical magical tradition. It's fascinating.
It's a shorthand, isn't it? Here's a magic book.
It is. You're right.
It's a symbol.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that. It's the grimoire as a symbol, which represents this whole sort of potential for things that could happen if you only have the book. And once you have the book, how you use it, if you use it wrongly, if you use it well, if you use it wisely, if it gets in the wrong hands, all the plot devices that can come out of that opening of a book or finding of a book are myriad.
You've touched on literacy being a very important part in the early story of the grimoire, and that tended to exclude women. So it is sort of maguses and magicians and male ceremonial magicians with their texts. But as the story moves on, women do enter into the story, and I'm thinking about sort of 20th century witchcraft and people actually writing their own grimoires.
Yeah.
So it becomes more like a journal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you look at this pseudo authorship, they're all men.
Yeah.
You know, I can't think of any text this is a famous. You get things like, you know, old Mother Shipton's prophecies and things like that, but they're not conjurations. They're not. These aren't masters or mistresses of magical power. You know. So yeah, it is a masculine, as represented in terms of authorship and knowledge, masculine. But when you look at historical records, you know, I'm thinking of the witch trial era, for example, and we've got cunning folk there. We've got cunning women in the 17th century in Europe who have some knowledge of literacy and do have magic books. So we know they were using them. So this isn't, you know, the author, the 100% total sort of male authorship is not representing actual usage on the ground. And so there are, as female literacy increases, inevitably more women, some will be attracted to looking and obtaining magic books. So yeah, so that does happen as a historical process as we go along. But today, and certainly over the last 40 years, and particularly the last 20 years, we have had this new kind of neo-pagan, neo-Wiccan tradition, or sometimes you might call it hedge witching, witches or whatever. But the whole concept of you move away from a hierarchy, you know.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, no, and you know, Wicca was founded by Gerald Gardner. Guess what? He's a man, you know, at the head of the coven, sort of thing, you know. And so the whole idea of being liberated from a hierarchical structure still, which was all part of Golden Dawn and then Wicca, to the fact that actually I will create my own magic. I will create my own magic book. It's quite empowering, and I think very appealing. And so, whether you're a male or a man or a woman magician or whatever, you're in control of what you're doing, you know. And that's also backed up with, particularly from the 1990s, when you had these young witches, magicians in shows like, you know, Buffy and Charmed and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and they all have their books. They're fundamental again, but these are all young women empowered and have the knowledge. They don't need men to perform any of this. They don't need to rely on, you know, some lead in some coven. They're doing it for themselves, you know.
Yeah.
And you can create your own book. You don't need to rely on someone else. You don't need to rely on a book which is attributed to a man.
Yeah, the appeal to authority doesn't have the same impact, I guess. Now, you are president of the Folklore Society, is that correct?
Recently finished my stint. I am now merely vice president of the Folklore Society. Yeah.
Right.
I've done my 3 years. I've done my 3 years.
What sort of thing do they get up to? Is there an overlap?
Well, there is, in the sense of, you know, it's society was founded in 1878. It's what, you know, it's the oldest folklore society in the world, kind of, you know, the mother of all folklore societies. You know, from 1878, it founded its own journal as well. It's a learned society, and has been, and it's, you know, it's there to advance and promote the study of folklore, whether it be, you know, in academics or whether it be independent researchers. And the great things about folklore studies is that, right from the beginning and right through to today, a lot of the work that's done is by independent scholars outside of a higher education system. So, you know, they're a fundamental part of the discipline, which is great. Our aim is to promote the study of folklore. And, you know, people often go, "What's the difference between folklore? What is folklore?" And, you know, and at the beginnings, you know, folklore and anthropology are very close, and anthropology ended up being an academic discipline in this country, and folklore didn't, although folklore is an academic discipline in North America and parts of Europe. So Britain is the odd one out when it comes to not having academic folklore. Although there are academic folklorists, they're just not in their creative writing departments and history departments like myself, or English literature or whatever, you know. So we're there. But we don't have our own departments here. So, you know, the folk society is important as a focus, and its journal is important as a vehicle for disseminating studies. And, you know, I call myself a historian and folklorist. Sometimes I'm writing history, sometimes I'm writing folklore, and sometimes I'm using folklore as a source material in the writing of history. So, you know, I can swap hats here, as I have done throughout my career. So I've just finishing writing an article for the journal on the folklore of ice cream vans, for example, which is purely a kind of a folkloristic approach as well. Whereas at the same time, I'm writing Art of the Grimoire, which is a sweeping history of visual magic across the whole globe. So yeah, wide and diverse, and folklore is an excellent way of looking at magic from a particular perspective.
I like to think you might all get together at a full moon sometime, or dance around a toadstool. None of that, though. Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, so
No.
I'm sure that would be very secret. Thank you. That's been so brilliant to talk to you about all of this. They're really fascinating books. I'm going to finish with my 3 questions. Yes, do you have a favourite artwork, a non-magical artwork? Because I mean, there's so much.
Oh yeah,
in here, but yeah.
I deliberately chose something which is not magical, but is in a sense feels magical, and that would be Giuseppe Archimboldo's.
The fruit and vegetable.
Vegetables, and the portraits made out of fish and fruit and vegetables, or books. And I've always been fascinated with his work, because it's both visually extraordinary and striking, but at the same time, the idea of portraiture, in the 16th century, and kind of making faces and portraits out of seasonal vegetables. Yeah, he finds a fascinating insight into the meaning of the symbolism of it as well. So yeah, Archimboldo has always fascinated me, which is a non-magical, but at the same time, it is quite magical to look at.
Wasn't his patron Rudolph II, who was?
Yeah, he was. He was.
Yeah,
exactly that. So there is a connection there, with, as you say, Rudolph was fascinated with alchemy and things, and so you can understand why the representations of humans in animal or vegetable form tied in with notions of alchemical essence and meaning, I suspect.
Yeah. And is there a book that you've unaccountably failed to read by now and feel a bit guilty about?
Not in terms of history, no. But when I was thinking about the question, a lot of the students who take our MA in folklore studies at the university, for example, and a lot of folklorists are all avid readers of Terry Pratchett, and I've never read any Terry Pratchett. So there's one I should really get into, but I've never read any Terry Pratchett yet. So there you are.
Oh, well, there's a great one. I think it's called The Hogfather, and that's his version. So it's the Discworld.
Yeah,
it's
Discworld,
his version of Christmas, and it's
right.
very, very funny. And I think Mort is the one with the figure of death. So I think you'd enjoy them.
No, everyone tells me this, and there's lots of folklore. He was
absolutely.
And magic. I mean, in one of his books, I know that he makes play of Necronomicon, which is a presented H.P. Lovecraft book. So he Terry Pratchett was into these sorts of histories and folklore. So yeah,
he knows that field.
Yeah, he does.
And the Necronomicon is the most famous book of magic that doesn't actually exist.
Exactly. Yeah.
So finally, I did start with a little joke. I imagine when you tell people what you do and what you write, you get some amusing feedback. So what's the funniest or weirdest thing anybody's ever said to you about your work?
I don't think of anything particularly weird, actually. I was trying to think through this. I've had some outrageously bad comments about my work, and
we like those.
Amazon feedback is pretty good for that. So I've had Amazon feedback which said, I remember one which said I wrote like a moron, which is quite which made me laugh. And I do remember a long time ago, it was a journal article I submitted or something, and some obviously unpleasant academic literally just scribbled in pencil on a fax and just said, has the author read his own work? And that was it. So
Wow.
which
Wow.
I say, I always treat criticism with a laugh these days, because there's no point taking it to heart. So I write like a moron. It's probably one of the things that.
Well, it should go on the back of the book. I
Yeah.
mean, some people actually use that stuff as quotes, don't they?
Yeah.
Sort of, who is this absolute fool? Well, you don't write like a moron. I beg
Very
to
good of you.
disagree.
Very good of you to say.
I thoroughly enjoyed this book, The Art of the Grimoire. I'm going to banish you now from whence you came.
Okay.
Thank you.
A puff of smoke.
But thank you very much for joining me in the book bag, Owen Davies, who does not write like a moron.
Excellent. Thank you, Suzi.
Cheers. Goodbye. And remember, if you don't want to be cursed eternally, please do hit like and subscribe, and we will carry on bringing really fun people to you to talk to, like Owen Davies. Here we are again, The Art of the Grimoire, published by Yale. Join me next time in the book bag, and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.